The desert doesn't forgive weakness, but sometimes it hides the kindest hearts and the most broken souls. In a forgotten corner of the frontier, where the sun scorched every inch of land and the wind howled through the bones of old cabins, a boy with no name and no family made his stand against fate. He was no more than a child when life turned its back on him, leaving him alone in a world that had already decided who would live and who would vanish. Yet even in that silence, even among the ruins of a life that never began, his spirit refused to bow. All he had was a torn hat, a wounded heart, and a loyal dog that understood his pain better than any man ever could. They wandered aimlessly through ghost towns and dust storms until they stumbled upon what looked like the remains of a once proud cabin, its walls leaning like old men, its roof half-eaten by time. But to the boy, it wasn't a ruin, it was a promise. There, in that broken shell of wood and memory, he saw a chance to build something the world had denied him, a home. While others saw splinters and decay, he saw shelter. While others would have turned away, he took off his hat, looked at the sunset bleeding into the desert sky, and whispered, "We'll make it, buddy." His dog wagged its tail, and in that small gesture, two lives bound by loss found their first spark of hope. Days turned into weeks, and under the ruthless sun, the boy worked with hands cracked and bleeding. He gathered wood, fixed the leaks, patched the holes, and turned every grain of sand into a silent witness of his determination. Every nail he drove into those walls was a defiance against destiny. The dog guarded him through the nights, when coyotes howled and loneliness crept through the cracks. And in the stillness of the desert, something began to change. Not just the cabin, but the boy himself. The pain that once chained his heart started to fade, replaced by a quiet pride born from survival. He didn't just rebuild a home, he rebuilt his soul. That cabin became more than wood and stone. It became a symbol of what it means to rise from nothing. Travelers passing by would stop, astonished to see a young cowboy and his loyal dog tending a garden where once there was only dust. They'd whisper about the boy who turned emptiness into life, and how his laughter echoed like a hymn across the desert wind. What began as tragedy slowly turned into legend, a story whispered around campfires about the child who found peace in the ruins, and the dog who never left his side. Together, they carved beauty out of desolation, turning a forgotten cabin into a paradise of hope, love, and redemption. And though the desert still burned, it no longer seemed cruel. Because in one small corner of that endless wilderness, a boy who had nothing proved that even the loneliest hearts can bloom under the harshest sun. The mornings in the desert came without mercy. The sun rose like a burning blade, cutting through the silence that wrapped the boy's new world. He woke before dawn each day, the dog pressed close to him, both shivering in the early chill. The moment light touched the horizon, he began to work. His hands, small but stubborn, turned cracked earth into soil, dragging water from a stream miles away with an old tin bucket. Each drop that reached his cabin was a victory, a rebellion against the fate that once called him unwanted. The desert watched, unmoved, yet something sacred began to stir within its endless sands. Every nail he drove into that cabin echoed across the valley like the heartbeat of survival. The boy had no words for faith or destiny, but he lived them through his grit. He patched the roof with dry grass and resin, used driftwood to mend the walls, and shared every crust of bread with his four-legged companion. At night, when the coyotes cried and the wind whispered through the cracks, the boy whispered back, "We made it another day." It wasn't a prayer. It was a promise to the ghost of his past, to the child who had once been left behind. Days blurred into one another. The seasons changed, but not the boy's resolve. He began to plant small patches of wildflowers behind the cabin, not because they could feed him, but because beauty, he thought, was something even the poor deserved. The dog would lie nearby, tail flicking in the dust, watching every move. And slowly, the cabin stopped looking like a ruin. It became a refuge. The cracks were still there, the scars still visible, but inside those walls lived something pure, the kind of peace that only comes to those who've lost everything and still choose to create. When rain finally came, it fell hard, like redemption from the heavens. The boy stood outside, arms stretched, face tilted up, laughing for the first time in years. His dog barked and ran circles around him, splashing through puddles as lightning painted the sky in silver streaks. The cabin, soaked and trembling, held strong. It was no longer a broken relic of another man's failure. It was the proof that even in ruin, life could begin again. And from that day forward, travelers who passed through the valley spoke of the strange sight, a boy's cabin glowing with light in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by blooming wildflowers and guarded by a loyal dog. To them, it was a miracle. To the boy, it was simply home, the one he built from ashes, sorrow, and faith he didn't know he had. But the desert had its own lessons to teach, lessons carved in hardship and tested through loneliness. One night, a storm unlike any he'd ever seen swept across the horizon. The wind roared like 1,000 spirits, tearing through the valley, breaking fences, lifting the sand until it blinded him. He held the dog close, covering its head with his coat, as the roof creaked and moaned under the fury of the sky. Hours passed in chaos until silence finally returned, a silence that sounded too heavy to be peace. When dawn came, the boy stepped outside to find half his work undone. The garden was buried under sand, the water barrels overturned, and part of the cabin's roof was gone. He stared for a long moment, heart sinking, his small world scattered like pieces of his past. The dog whimpered beside him, sensing his despair. For a moment, he thought of leaving, of walking away into the endless dunes and letting fate decide. But then his eyes fell on a single flower still standing, half-bent, dust-covered, but alive. It was enough. That morning, something in him hardened. He began again. With raw hands and a determined heart, he fixed what the storm had tried to destroy. He built stronger beams, dug deeper wells, and sealed every gap that the wind could find. He didn't cry this time. He didn't even speak. The silence was his prayer, his defiance. The desert had tested him and failed to break him. Weeks later, a traveler passed by, an old man riding a mule, face lined like dried riverbeds. He stopped to rest and asked for water. The boy offered what little he had without hesitation. When the man drank and looked around, he said softly, "You live here alone?" The boy nodded. "Ain't many who'd survive out here," the man said, shaking his head. "But you didn't just survive. You built something holy." Those words stayed with him long after the traveler rode away, echoing in his mind like the call of destiny itself. Because maybe, deep down, the boy knew this cabin, this life wasn't just his refuge. It was a message to the world, a testament that even in a land where the sun kills and the nights bite, a single act of courage, repeated day after day, can turn desolation into paradise. And in that truth, the boy found not only purpose, but peace. As the years crept by, the boy began to grow, not just in age but in spirit. The child who once wandered alone had become a young cowboy, his shoulders strong, his voice calm, his gaze steady as the horizon. The dog had grown old beside him, its muzzle gray and eyes wise, yet it never left his side. Together, they had carved a rhythm of life out of silence, tending the small garden, mending fences, and watching the sun die in gold and red over the dunes. The boy had learned that the desert, cruel as it seemed, gave back what was earned, nothing more, nothing less. One afternoon, as he repaired the well, a faint sound reached his ears, the rhythmic thud of hooves. A horse approached from the south, carrying a young woman draped in dust and exhaustion. Her face was hidden beneath a worn hat, her voice faint as she asked, "Do you have water to spare?" Without a word, he handed her a cup, the same way he once had to the traveler. She drank slowly, her trembling hands revealing more than her silence. Something about her reminded him of who he once was, lost, tired, and searching for a reason to stay alive. Over the days that followed, she stayed to recover her strength. She told him little about herself, only that she had run away from a town that had no mercy for the poor. The boy didn't ask questions. He understood too well what it meant to escape something cruel. As the days turned into weeks, they worked side by side, rebuilding the garden and repairing what time had worn down. The dog followed them everywhere, as if guarding a secret it had waited years to see fulfilled. At night, when the fire crackled and the stars opened wide above the desert, She would hum old songs, soft, trembling tunes that seemed to come from another life. The boy listened in silence, the flames dancing across his face. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond survival. He didn't know what to call it. Maybe comfort, maybe belonging, maybe love. The kind that didn't need words to exist. But deep inside, he also felt fear. Fear that the peace he built could be taken away, like everything before. The desert had given him a home, a purpose, and now perhaps a heart to lose. And in the Old West, where kindness was as rare as rain, he knew that love was the most dangerous thing of all. One morning, she was gone. No footprints, no note, only silence. The boy stood by the doorway, staring into the horizon where the dunes met the sky. The dog sniffed around, whining softly, as if it too could feel the emptiness left behind. He didn't know why she had come, nor why she had left. But the cabin felt colder now, heavier, as if the walls themselves mourned her absence. For days, he didn't speak. He worked, ate, and slept, but the spark that had lit his days had dimmed. Then, one evening, as he sat by the dying fire, he found something folded beneath a jar, a small piece of paper, worn and smudged with dirt. On it were 5 words, written in a trembling hand. "You taught me to live." He held that note for a long time, his rough fingers brushing the ink as if it were something sacred. And in that moment, he realized she hadn't left because she wanted to. She had left because she could, because he had given her something no one else ever had: hope. That night, he walked outside and looked at the stars, the same ones that had once watched over him as a lost child. The wind was cold, but not cruel. He whispered into it, "Thank you, not to her, not to the sky, but to life itself, for teaching him that love doesn't always stay, but it always changes what it touches." After that night, he worked with a new strength. He expanded the garden, built a small corral, and even carved her name into the wood of the cabin door. The dog followed him faithfully, slower now, older, but with the same devotion as the day they'd found that broken cabin together. And as the years passed, the boy who had once been abandoned grew into a man who never abandoned anything. The cabin became a landmark for travelers, a place of rest, a place whispered about in towns as the paradise of the desert. But to him, it was never about fame or fortune. It was about keeping a promise to the child he once was, to never stop building, no matter how many storms came. Time in the desert doesn't pass, it lingers. It moves like the wind, slow and heavy, reshaping everything without asking permission. The boy had become a man now, his hair sun-bleached, his hands lined like the canyon walls. The dog, old and tired, could no longer run across the dunes but lay by the cabin door, watching the sunsets they once chased together. Every day, the man spoke softly to him, telling stories of the old days, of the broken cabin, the storms, the travelers, and the girl who sang beneath the stars. The dog's eyes would shine faintly, as if it remembered every sound, every scent, every drop of rain they had survived. One evening, as the horizon glowed red, the dog didn't get up. The man sat beside him for hours, stroking his fur, whispering the same words he had once whispered to himself in the darkest nights. "We made it another day." But this time, the words trembled. When dawn came, the dog was gone, and the man buried his only friend beneath the flowering patch behind the cabin, the one that had survived every storm. He built a small wooden cross and placed the dog's collar at its base, saying nothing, because words couldn't hold the weight of gratitude he felt. After that day, the desert felt different. The silence was deeper, but not empty. The man felt the dog's presence in the whisper of the wind, in the rustle of the sand, in the strength that still pushed him forward. Some nights, he thought he heard soft footsteps by the cabin door, or the faint bark echoing from far away. But instead of grief, he felt peace, because the dog hadn't truly left. He had simply become part of the land they both loved. The man began to write in an old journal he found in the ruins years ago. He wrote not for anyone to read, but to remember. He wrote about loss, hope, and the strange kindness hidden in suffering. He wrote about how the desert had raised him, shaped him, and tested him until he became as unbreakable as the stones beneath his boots. His words were rough, misspelled, and simple, but they carried truth, and truth was all he ever had. Travelers who visited the cabin would often find him sitting on the porch, journal in hand, eyes distant but calm. Some stayed to share stories, others to rest their weary souls. And every time they left, they carried with them something invisible, the quiet strength of a man who had learned to turn pain into purpose and emptiness into home. It was one of those travelers, a young preacher passing through, who first spread the story of the cowboy of the desert. He spoke of a man who lived alone with the ghosts of the past and the blessings of the earth, a man who had tamed not the land, but his own sorrow. In nearby towns, people began to talk about him as if he were more legend than man, a spirit of resilience, a saint of solitude. But the cowboy never called himself anything. He just kept working, tending to the land, fixing the roof, planting seeds. Fame had no meaning in a place where even names were carried away by the wind. Yet one day, that wind brought something unexpected, a wagon, broken and limping through the dunes, carrying a woman and her child. Their horse had collapsed, and they were lost, desperate for shelter. The man helped them without hesitation, giving them water, food, and rest. The little boy reminded him of himself, small, quiet, eyes too old for his age. As he repaired their wagon, the woman told him their story, how they had lost everything in a raid, how they had been wandering ever since. The cowboy listened without judgment, his silence a form of understanding deeper than words. When they left, the woman pressed something into his hand, a silver cross, worn and bent. "For kindness," she said. "You're the first soul who didn't turn us away." He watched them disappear into the horizon, the child waving until they vanished. For the first time in years, he felt tears on his face, but they weren't of sorrow. They were of recognition. He had once been that child, lost and forgotten, and now he was the shelter he once sought. After that day, travelers began to arrive more often. Some came for water, some for a place to sleep, some simply to see the man whose story had spread across the plains. He welcomed them all, not as a hero, but as a host. He shared food, stories, and silence in equal measure. And in the middle of that barren desert, something extraordinary happened. Life returned. A small community began to form around the cabin, a handful of wanderers, widows, and orphans who had nowhere else to go. They brought with them laughter, music, and prayer. The cowboy watched them with quiet awe. The cabin that once held one broken soul now sheltered many. And for the first time, the man who had built a paradise for himself realized that he had built it for everyone who had ever been lost. The desert valley that once echoed with silence now hummed with the sound of life. Children's laughter mixed with the crackle of firewood and the distant neigh of horses. The once solitary cabin had grown, new walls, new rooms, a small well nearby that never seemed to run dry. Around it, tents and shacks appeared, built by the hands of wanderers who found something they didn't know they were looking for, belonging. And at the center of it all stood the cowboy, no longer a boy, no longer just a survivor, but the quiet heart of a community that had learned to live through his example. He never gave speeches. He never called himself a leader. Yet when something broke, he fixed it. When someone argued, he listened. And when despair crept in, as it often does where the past still haunts, he reminded them that the desert takes only what you refuse to protect. His hands still bore scars from his younger days, and his face carried the sun's mark, but his eyes held something ageless, peace earned through pain. The people called him the man of the wind, because no matter how strong the storms were, he always stood his ground. One afternoon, as he was mending a fence, a rider approached from the horizon, a young woman, her face half covered by a scarf. She dismounted slowly, and when she spoke, her voice trembled. "Do you remember me?" she asked. It took him a moment, but then, beneath the years and dust, he saw her, the girl who once sang by the fire, who had left him a note that said, "You taught me to live." Time had changed her, yet her eyes were the same. They spoke little at first. There was no need for long explanations. The desert doesn't deal in words. It deals in truths. She told him she had built a life, one with meaning, one born from the courage he had given her. When she heard stories of the cowboy of the desert, She knew it was him and came to see for herself. Together they walked through the small settlement, the people greeting her with warmth, unaware they were witnessing a circle closing. Two lost souls who had once healed each other now reunited, not in longing, but in peace. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. She sang again, her voice soft but strong, weaving through the cool wind. The cowboy sat beside her, silent, listening. Around them, the people of the desert gathered, their faces glowing with wonder. None of them knew the whole story, but in that moment, they didn't need to. The song carried it all: loss, love, resilience, and the miracle of starting over. Years passed, and the settlement became a small town, the kind that wasn't marked on any map but lived in the memory of every traveler who found it. They called it Redemption Valley. The cabin remained at its center, still standing strong, its wood darkened by time, but never broken. The cowboy grew old, his hair silver like desert moonlight. The woman stayed by his side, tending to the garden that once bloomed for only one heart and now fed dozens. The children of the valley often gathered around them at dusk, begging for stories of the early days, of storms, dogs, and flowers that refused to die. He would smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling. It began with nothing, he'd say, and maybe that's why it became everything. Then he'd tell them how the cabin was found, how a boy and his dog turned it into a home. His words came slow, steady, like the wind through canyon walls. The children would sit still, captivated not by grand adventures or gunfights, but by something far rarer, the quiet power of endurance. When the children asked about the dog, he'd point to the patch of wildflowers behind the cabin. "He's still here," he'd whisper. "Every bloom that grows there carries a bit of his spirit." And somehow, even the rowdiest child would fall silent, staring at the flowers as though they could feel the loyalty buried beneath them. As the years deepened, more wanderers came seeking the same refuge the cowboy had once sought, a place to rest, to heal, to start again. And though his strength began to fade, his presence never did. The people built him a small chair by the porch, where he would sit each evening, watching the valley glow gold beneath the setting sun. He never said it aloud, but in his heart, he knew what began as survival had turned into legacy. And sometimes, when the desert wind blew just right, carrying the scent of rain and the faint rustle of blooming petals, he could almost hear it again. The soft bark of his old friend, the laughter of the girl who once sang, and the whispers of every soul who had found peace in the valley he built with his bare hands. It was in those moments that the cowboy understood paradise wasn't a place. It was the courage to begin again, and the love that makes it worth staying. As age pressed upon his bones, the cowboy began to move slower, yet his spirit remained untamed, steady as the desert wind that had once tried to break him. The people of Redemption Valley often found him sitting by the porch at dawn, staring into the rising sun with that same boyish wonder he'd carried all his life. To them, he was a living story, a man who had wrestled fate and turned it into faith. Some called him a saint, others a legend. But in his heart, he still saw himself as the same orphaned boy who once whispered to a loyal dog, promising they'd make another day. One morning, a young boy from the settlement, curious, wild, full of questions, approached him and asked, "Why did you never leave this place, sir? The world's so big out there." The old cowboy smiled, his eyes soft as he replied, "Because some folks spend their whole life looking for a place that feels like home. When you find it, you don't need to chase anything else." The boy nodded, not fully understanding yet, but something in that answer would stay with him forever, like a seed buried deep in the soul, waiting for its time to grow. In the evenings, when the sky turned red and the wind carried the scent of mesquite, the cowboy would sit with the woman who had returned. They didn't speak much. Words weren't necessary between two souls who had already said everything through the way they lived. Sometimes she'd read from his old journal, her voice trembling over pages worn by sand and sweat. "You wrote this when you were just a boy," she'd say. "Did you ever think it would become something more?" He'd chuckle softly, shaking his head. "I wasn't writing for the world," he'd answer. "I was writing so I wouldn't forget who I was." But time, relentless as the desert sun, never bargains. One winter morning, the people of the valley found the cowboy still in his chair by the porch, his hat resting low over his face, the dawn light washing him in gold. His eyes were closed, his hands folded over his chest, and the faintest smile lingered on his lips, the kind of peace only a life fully lived can grant. The woman who had stood beside him for all those years wept quietly, yet even through the tears, she smiled too, because she knew he hadn't died alone. He had simply gone home. They buried him beneath the wildflower patch, right beside the dog he had loved, the one who had carried him through the silence of his youth. The people of Redemption Valley built a simple wooden marker that read, "Here rests the man who taught us to live." And every year, when the first spring bloom rose through the sand, the children of the valley would bring flowers to his grave, whispering his story once more so it would never fade into the wind. Years rolled into decades, and the story of the cowboy spread beyond the valley, carried by travelers, preachers, and wanderers who swore they had seen the place where a boy and his dog turned desolation into paradise. Redemption Valley became a name spoken with reverence, a symbol of endurance, compassion, and rebirth. Generations came and went, yet the cabin still stood, weathered but unyielding, its wooden frame now wrapped in vines and memory. Some said, when the wind blew hard enough, you could hear faint laughter carried from long ago, a boy's laughter, wild and free, echoing through the sands. A young woman once rode into the valley searching for peace after losing everything in a fire. She was greeted not with questions, but with kindness, the same kindness the cowboy had shown countless souls before her. She stayed, and as she rebuilt her life, she often asked about the man whose story seemed to live in every wall and flower. The elders told her about the orphaned boy, the storm, the loyal dog, and the girl who sang to the stars. They told her how one life, born in ruin, had become the root of a whole community's hope. At night, she'd walk to the old grave behind the cabin and sit beneath the sky that never changed. The stars shimmered above her, the same ones that once guided the cowboy through his loneliness. "Thank you," she would whisper into the wind, though she never met him, "for teaching us all how to begin again." And somehow, the air around her would grow still, not silent, but listening, as if the desert itself remembered every heartbeat that had once filled it with purpose. In time, the valley became more than a place. It became a legend. People said that no matter how broken you arrived, you'd leave with something new. Not gold, not fame, but peace. And perhaps that was the truest miracle of all. Because the cowboy's greatest gift wasn't the cabin he built or the community he inspired. It was the truth he proved with his life. That even in the loneliest deserts of the soul, love and faith can bloom if you refuse to give up. And so the story lived on, passed from parent to child, wanderer to traveler, written in the dust and sung in the wind. The desert that once took everything from a boy had given him eternity. And as long as one flower continued to bloom behind that old cabin, the world would remember the cowboy who turned a broken home into a paradise of the heart. In the heart of the desert, where everything seems to fade with time, one story refused to die. The tale of the abandoned boy and his loyal dog lived on, not because of gold or glory, but because it carried the purest truth the West ever knew. That love, resilience, and faith can turn even the harshest wasteland into a sanctuary. His journey wasn't about conquering the land, but about conquering despair. Every plank he nailed, every drop of sweat that hit the sand, built not just a cabin, but a legacy, a reminder that strength isn't born from comfort, but from the courage to begin again, even when everything's gone. The cowboy's life became more than a story. It became a mirror. It showed that no one is truly lost, not while there's still breath and will to keep building. His home rose from ruin, his heart from loneliness, and his faith from silence. The dog, the girl, the storms, and the people who found redemption in his valley were not coincidences. They were chapters of a single truth. When you give your pain a purpose, it becomes light for others lost in the dark. And that light never fades. It multiplies through every act of kindness born from it. Perhaps that's the real secret hidden in his story. The desert, the storms, even the endless horizon, they were never his enemies. They were his teachers. They carved him, tested him, and in doing so, revealed something timeless. That broken things, when rebuilt with love, become stronger than before. His cabin still stands not because it escaped the wind, but because it learned to stand with it. And so do we. Every time we refuse to let life's storms erase who we are meant to be. Now, as you think of that boy who once had nothing but a dream and a dog, ask yourself, what are you building from the pieces life has left you? The cowboy's story isn't trapped in the past. It's alive in everyone who dares to find beauty in struggle, hope in heartbreak, and purpose in pain. You don't need a cabin in the desert to start again. All you need is a reason, and the faith to believe that even one act of courage can change everything. If this story touched something inside you, take a moment to keep it alive. Share what you felt in the comments, tell others what part of this journey spoke to your heart, and subscribe to be part of more stories like this one. Stories that remind us that no matter how broken life gets, the human spirit is capable of rebuilding, of healing, of blooming again. Because somewhere out there, beneath the endless sky, another heart is waiting for a reason to believe. And maybe your voice is the one that helps it find the way.